To begin our panel on the contraction of democracy and new struggles for representation, we'll begin with an audience polling question. Our question is, if we could prioritize one solution for enhancing the democratic process, it would be, and here you have options: fair and equitable distribution of polling places, universal voter registration, the elimination of voter identification provisions, the elimination of felony disenfranchisement laws, instituting a voting holiday. Now, as many of you in the room know, I was a voting rights lawyer in my past life, so this conversation is particularly interesting for me. And I have dear friends on this panel, starting off with our moderator, Vivek Malhotra. Vivek leads the Ford Foundation's work on civil and human rights. He's worked to advance immigrant and migrant rights, racial justice and minority rights, and civil and criminal justice reform, making grants in the United States, Mexico, and Central America. Vivek has been with the Ford Foundation since 2011, bringing to the foundation 14 years of public policy and legal advocacy experience as a strategist and policy advocate at the national, state, and local levels in the United States, and as an attorney in legal practice. I also know that Vic is also an organizer. So let's see, our results. The results from our polling looks like universal voter registration.
Interesting. It's the right answer.
Is, I think there are several right answers on this one. But that, I'll leave it, I'll take it,
Right.
give it to you, Vic.
Disagree.
Thank you, Elena. So I hope everyone still has some energy in the room because we have a really important and great panel to talk about the contraction of democracy. And I know it's late in the day. I appreciate all the energy that's been in the room. The last two sessions since lunch have just been so exciting and provocative. And so I'm hoping that we will kind of continue in that vein. This is, as you all know, such a timely issue for us to be talking about, given the current climate in our country, both, the suppression of voting that we all are seeing in policy and practices around the country. Also, the fact that we are in the midst of a presidential election and we are, in silly season. And so issues of power and representation and influence really just get crazy at this point. And this election has not, has lived up, I should say, to that reputation. So let me just offer some framing remarks, and then what we're going to do is have this I'm going to introduce this panel, and we're just going to get right into it, and then we want to save enough time for some robust Q&A with all of you. We have an hour together, and someone's going to help me keep time? Right there. Okay, great. So I'll be on the lookout for you. So one of the reasons why this topic was picked for the Urban Roundtable is really that we all know that we are experiencing tremendous demographic shifts in the country. And with those demographic changes, we know there's a lot of anxiety, racial anxiety, that has led to both changes and backlash. Especially given the challenges to the entrenched power structure. But it also has presented real opportunities, especially in urban centers, to think about how we strengthen a more diverse representation in government and greater accountability to communities of color. So that is an important area for exploration today. And then in this environment, we really want to think about how do we build a more inclusive democracy. We also want to explore what does a strong policy agenda to address the structural barriers to democratic participation and representation in the 21st century look like. And with intransigence in Congress and real risks and challenges in bringing litigation in the federal courts, though we all know there are changes afoot there as well, what is a viable pathway forward for policy reform and litigation, and what is needed to help change the climate. And lastly, I really want us to think about, as we go into this conversation, how advocates and movements that are seeking to protect and strengthen democratic inclusion really need to connect better with the emerging social movements that are capturing public imagination and pushing for justice and equity in new ways. And we know that 50 years ago, young people throughout the country played a critical role in changing the climate for reform around civil rights and voting rights. And how should more established groups and stakeholders today connect with these growing movements around police accountability and immigration reform and criminalization or climate change to really identify and seek out a shared agenda and greater collective action around concrete policy ideas today? So with that, I want to introduce our panel. We've got Dan Tokaji, a professor of constitutional law at Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University, and really a renowned expert on election law and voting rights. We have next to him the wonderful Judith Brown-Dianis, who's the co-director of the Advancement Project, which she joined in 1999 following a distinguished career as a civil rights attorney at LDF and as a managing attorney for their DC office. And then finally next to Judith, we've got Tom Sines, professor of constitutional law. I'm sorry, that's Dan. President and General Counsel. But you probably did teach
we get confused all the time.
No, President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and of course has had a long career as a leading civil rights attorney with Mulduff and advisor to Mayor Villaraigosa. So with that, let me sit down with our panelists. I don't think I need this mic at the podium. I've got
your own.
I got my own. So let me just start out with this question about the environment right now. We're here to talk about the contraction of democracy. Why are we here to talk about the contraction? What's driving this contraction? What's driving the retrenchment that we're seeing today after 50 years of gains on civil and voting rights? Let me start with Judith on that question.
So first, thanks for having me. Glad to be here. I think in this moment, clearly the conversation, which is hate-filled and other-filled, there's a clear othering going on, so that America is becoming more divided just by the narrative, really is embedded in the changing demographics of America and the concern and fear of those who have been in power about what they are about to lose. I would suspect that if you have been in the position of having power and oppressing people, that you might be a little bit scared about what's going to happen when the oppressed become the majority. And so that is a shift in which the fear is being shown through the language and discourse of this election, but also probably for some of us, the surprising amount of support that one of the candidates who is the most hateful is getting. But we also must know that history shows that this is the way that this country has gone. Every time there has been a shift in demographics, where we have seen an increase of the other, especially of people of color, we have contracted democracy. We have made it harder to vote. We have figured out ways in which we can create structures in which those who are coming to the country and are browning the country are not able to get power. And so when you look at history, there have been times when Italians coming to this country couldn't vote, when Jewish people couldn't vote, when Native Americans couldn't vote because they were not considered Americans and citizens. And so the Chinese coming couldn't vote. And so we are seeing the continuation of this pattern of keeping what has historically been white male landowners with privilege and money being able to control the political discourse and the political outcomes. And so, as Reverend Barber from North Carolina and Bob Moses both agree, this is the third Reconstruction, and we are here. And what we are seeing is just nothing new for our history and our journey around our democracy.
Thanks, Judith. Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about how this is manifesting itself, in the current landscape?
Yeah, I think that what Judith describes is what is real. There is demographic fear in certain sectors of the country across the board. And that is nothing new. I think with any demographic change, you see that kind of demographic fear. At its most innocent, it just is a mixture of nostalgia and concern for progeny. What are my kids, grandkids going to be growing up with, and how is that going to be different from what that individual may have grown up with? And you have a mix of that demographic fear with such demographic changes that there is a real survival threat for those who are in power and some of the institutions that exist today and have existed for a long, long period of time to continue. And then the two of them come together when you have politicians, and we've seen it time and time again, that choose to exploit that demographic fear rather than addressing it responsibly. And they do that despite example after example that is trading short-term gain for long-term threat. I come from a state, California, that changed permanently, and it's largely attributed to one governor, Pete Wilson's overreaction to demographic fear, his choice to exploit that demographic fear to secure his own re-election as short-term gain. But in the long term, he dealt his political party almost a death blow. I mean, the Republican Party today in California is really on the edges of existence. It may not exist in California in the near future, and in the very near future, decline to state voters will probably surpass Republicans in the state of California. So we've seen it there. We've seen it beginning in states like Arizona, where Jan Brewer engaged in the same sort of exploitation of demographic fear to secure her own reelection, to, I think, the long-term detriment of her party in Arizona as well. So the reaction to the demographic fear and the survival threat is often counterproductive from the perspective of those who want to preserve, and they end up creating even greater threat. The problem for all the rest of us is that as they go through the death throes, they're going to flail about in a way that is going to inflict tremendous damage on lots and lots of us, and that's what we have to be about, preventing and limiting.
Thanks. So Dan, I want to shift a little bit here and just get back to the title of this panel, The Contraction of Democracy. Almost all the issues that we've been talking about today have to do with democracy. But this panel in particular, I want you to help us understand, what are we talking about when we talk about democracy for purposes of this conversation?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I can actually bridge these last couple responses to this question, what is democracy? And let me focus it a bit more. What is the right to vote? So my answer to the first question, actually, at least the main answer, what's driving these attacks on the right to vote would be primarily it is partisan politics, right? That is what's driving Republicans in Texas to adopt these voter identification measures, or Republicans in North Carolina to adopt a set of disenfranchising measures that make it more difficult for African Americans to vote. Look, if African Americans and Latinos were evenly splitting their votes between Democrats and Republicans, I don't think we'd be seeing these kinds of laws. It is primarily partisan politics that is driving voter identification and these other restrictions on participation. But participation is just one dimension of the right to vote. The polling question, that all had to do with participation. But we need to think more broadly, and this goes to the question you asked me, Vic, about what the right to vote is. We need to think multidimensionally about the right to vote. It's not just participating in elections, being able to vote and have your votes counted. it's also being represented, being equally represented. And so here the threats are partisan gerrymandering and minority vote dilution, something that was greatly compromised, that is the fight against minority vote dilution, by the removal of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act effectively through the Shelby County decision a couple of years ago. And third and finally, the right to vote is also about influence. And here the big threat is concentrated wealth and the effect that it is having on the ability of the less affluent to have their voices heard down the street, in Congress, in state legislatures across the country, and even at the local level. And with respect to this dimension of the right to vote, our Supreme Court, the Roberts Court in particular, has not only not been helpful, it has been affirmatively destructive through the piece by piece, the brick by brick dismantling of our system by which to control the influence of money on our political system, which is why this vacancy on the Supreme Court that exists right now as to this dimension of the right to vote, and really all three, presents an enormously important opportunity.
I want to quibble with one thing that Dan
Quibble,
said,
quibble.
and then I want to expand on something that he said, which is I think reducing this to partisan politics fails to capture the magnitude of the moment, because partisan politics is something that we've dealt with throughout our history. I think you have to characterize it as survival anxiety and a reaction to that. When you have survival anxiety, that's when you get into these heavy-duty attempts to contract democracy, reduce participation. But I want to expand further on something he said. I think that being comprehensive means also recognizing that we have to be smart about what we vote upon. So I want to suggest that we vote on too much in this country, and that perhaps allows the money that over-influences elections to have even greater scope in terms of policymaking. I'll assert right now that, as happens in much of the western United States, sheriffs should not be elected. I think that what we've seen with elected sheriffs in state after state is corruption, is attempts to appeal to the least common denominator, which go opposite from where we need to be going in terms of our criminal justice policies, for example. I'll assert that we should not be electing district attorneys. We should not be electing judges. There are all kinds of offices that it does not make sense for us to put them up to popular election. And we've got to be comprehensive when we talk about democracy and include that as a part of the conversation as well.
So wait, because I want to quibble too.
All right, quibble away.
And then I'll respond to both of you.
Right. So I'm going to add on to your survival thing, because I do want to add the word race in that, and be explicit about that, because I do believe that if this was just about, I do believe there's partisan piece of this, but if it was just about partisan politics, it would mean that the Republican Party would figure out the numbers. They would, talk to some of the people in the room, demographers, get that data that we all know about, and they would have figured out that perhaps we should woo some of these people of color to our party, because then we could win. So haven't done that for a reason. Also, then I want to quibble with you about this idea of taking away some of the power around things that are incredibly important to our daily lives, like prosecutors. I do believe that people should be involved in electing prosecutors. I do believe we should have some transparency around those things. I, in fact, am concerned about the fact that contraction of democracy means that in the state of Michigan, we have emergency managers, which means that many of the emergency managers are placed in cities where they are predominantly African American, right, under the guise of having some fiscal problems in those cities and then taking the vote away from them, including in Chicago, where we cannot vote for a school board, which happens to be, I believe, the only place in the state of Illinois where the people cannot vote for their school board. And I think that there are demographics tied to that, and the fact that the contraction of democracy is not just about how we are creating barriers to the voting booth, but how we are creating structures that do not allow people of color to engage in democracy in an equal way.
And I'll just to respond. The issue, of course, you need electoral accountability. The question is whether a direct vote for a sheriff or a district attorney or a judge is the best form of electoral accountability for those positions. Where you eliminate all electoral accountability and then you impose from the top some sort of manager or some sort of receiver for a school district, you have eliminated electoral accountability at the local level entirely. I think you have to have electoral accountability, but it should be through folks who are appointing and have the ability to remove a police chief, for example, as with a sheriff, or a city prosecutor,
But I think
as
you
with a
have
district
to
attorney.
tell the people of Chicago and New York that. They feel like they have absolutely no say and there's no democracy that is working for them because Rahm and Bloomberg in the past, and probably the new mayor, have not been responsive to their needs.
So I want to get back to that. We are going to get to that, but let me give Dan a chance to respond, and then
Yeah, sure. I actually think there's much less disagreement here than may meet the eye. Don't understand me as denying that there is a close relationship between race and, let me be honest, racism and party. I mean, you can't look at what is happening in the Republican presidential contest right now and deny it, where, Donald Trump is not only using the dog whistles that we've seen many times in the past, but is actually blowing kisses at the KKK. I mean, and let me say further, there is a reason why people in the Republican Party are, at least some people, are extremely worried about this, because it could potentially mean, and may well mean, the breaking up of this coalition between the moneyed interests, right? Think Chamber of Commerce and Mitt Romney, and the sort of less affluent, less educated, predominantly white and predominantly male grassroots that form a substantial part of Donald Trump's support. My point is simply, and it's actually connected to the survival instinct that Tom mentions. That's exactly right. But the reason we're seeing these attacks on the right to vote, making it more difficult to vote, diluting minority representation, enhancing the influence of money on politics, and therefore diminishing the voice of the rest of us, has a lot to do with those in power wanting to hold on to that power and not letting in these new voices. And at some point, the Republican Party is going to have a day of reckoning, or it's going to collapse.
So our charge is also, in addition to kind of laying out this landscape, and I'm really glad that we have put these issues out there, is to really put forward some of the ideas and concepts that are necessary, issues, solutions that are necessary to address the structural barriers that you all have described very well. So let me turn to Tom on this. Can you talk to us a little bit about, at least aspirationally, let's start aspirationally, what do we need? What kind of policy changes do we need to address these barriers?
So I'm going to go back to one that we used successfully for 50 years, which is preclearance. And I think this unwelcome opportunity imposed upon us by a bad decision by the Supreme Court in Shelby County to eliminate the coverage formula actually gives us an opportunity to modernize and come up with an even better coverage formula. Preclearance has two process virtues. Number one, it ensures that you evaluate policies for the discriminatory impacts before they're implemented, before any harm is done. And number two, it does so in a much more efficient, less costly manner than what you're left with, which is basically post-implementation litigation with respect to a lot of the structures that exist to suppress minority rights. I think that it has two virtuous effects as well. Number one, it helps us to begin to break down this, what I would characterize as federalism fetishism that we have with respect to certain issues, that even though we recognize a federal role with respect to the vote, we still feel this need to give lots of discretion to states that then enact voter ID provisions and voter registration restrictions and the like, instead of recognizing that a truly well-supported federal right to vote means more and more federal mandates and the like. And of course, it doesn't only apply to the vote. It applies in other areas as well. I think I said in one of the earlier Chicago meetings of this group that we have this same obsession with federalism in the education context. And I just wonder if we took the pre-clearance regime that we used in voting for 50 years and we had done it for 50 years in education, so that school districts would have to pre-clear curriculum changes, changes in how teachers are assigned, major changes in resource allocation for whether they would have a discriminatory effect. Imagine how much progress we might have made in getting to education equity versus where we are today. So it helps to break down that overblown commitment to states' rights with respect to lots of really, really important issues. And the other virtuous effect is that it permits us to quickly and efficiently establish precedents even outside of covered jurisdictions. So if covered jurisdictions get struck down with respect to particular practice, then other jurisdictions know they ought not do the same, and if they do the same, they're going to be challenged, and challenged a bit more easily than they might be without the preclearance. Again, I think the key is modernizing it and recognizing that preclearance coverage needs to be based not only on a history of discrimination, but also on knowing, with 50 years of experience, what are the major mechanisms often used to suppress minority votes, and applying them in jurisdictions that don't have long histories. Because the demographic change that we started talking about means that there are lots of groups, including Latinos, who are becoming significant and therefore a threat to the existing political power structure in local and state jurisdictions across the country, but they haven't been there long enough to build up the history of violations. But we still ought to recognize that in those jurisdictions, they're going to adopt some of the same voter suppressing practices that the ones with a long history have used, and subject that to preclearance as well.
So Tom, the issue that you put on the table, we have to confront it primarily because of that Supreme Court decision 3 years ago in Shelby County. And, you've kind of laid out what the solution might be at the federal level, but we know that it has been quite elusive over the last few years. So I asked you to be aspirational, but I want us to get real about what's possible and to push back on this if you feel like federal reform of the Voting Rights Act is possible today. But if it's not, how do we get to policy solutions that are possible at the federal or the state level? Particularly at the state level, I think we've seen some recent victories and gains. We know people are working on the ground in some of the battlegrounds in the South, in some of the formerly covered jurisdictions. What's possible today? I ask all of the panelists, so whoever wants to jump in on that.
So I usually don't work on what's possible. Because otherwise I wouldn't even be sitting here if I was talking about what's possible. So a few things that I think, since we're in an urban America forward, is that looking at voter ID, for example, one thing that we should be looking at is at the city level, how cities can institute a broader concept of what identification is needed or not needed, right? There could be multiple forms of identification. We know, for example, in Wisconsin, when Advance Project was involved in litigation there around voter ID, in Milwaukee, at the time, 76% of African American males did not have the ID that was required in the city of Milwaukee. And so ID, and I know in New York, this was another problem, New York City, a lot of young people who don't engage with government for lots of reasons, and who don't go to a bank to deposit their checks, are not usually walking around with the kind of ID that's required. So I think we have to figure out alternative kinds of ID. The other thing that I would say is that we also have to work on, and I think if you do it at the city level, even if it's for city elections, then make it a two-tier requirement, right? Because election officials hate two-tier requirements, right? And they start to want to push it to, let's do this for the whole state. The other thing is on disenfranchisement of people with felony convictions. You think about Florida, 1.4 million people cannot vote because they have a felony conviction. You think about this from the perspective of communities that have been decimated by an illegal and unfair and unjust war on drugs, and where our voices have been taken. And so how do we get to the point where people with felony convictions can have their rights restored, but that also we are thinking about, should people in some places, people vote from jail? And why should you not have a voice? And let's go back and think about the history of those laws, which are actually Reconstruction era statutes that were actually meant to hit Black people who were newly freed slaves, who were engaging in so-called moral turpitude laws, so those kinds of things. And then for us, I'm sorry, because again, I have to be aspirational, is that I do want to piggyback on this federalism thing, because we actually at Advancement Project have a campaign for a constitutional amendment for a right to vote, because we want to make voting and participation as important to people as their guns and their free speech. And so that we will reinvigorate a voting rights movement, but also that we'll have national standards, because we have 13,000 election jurisdictions that run elections 13,000 different ways. And that we will be able to think about how we vote as a country and have some unity around those things.
So what's possible? Let me talk about avenues that are possible. If we just look down the street here, what's possible in the current Congress that's any good? Nothing, right? I mean, let's be honest. But, there may be possibilities in the future in Congress. And what I would like to see, my long-term aspiration is, I'd love to see the answer that most of you chose. Universal voter registration. We've seen it in some states. If you look at the data, the election reform that is most closely correlated with increasing participation and broadening the electorate is voter registration reform. In the meantime, in at least some states, there's the possibility of moving forward with progressive reforms that would broaden the electorate. We've seen these kinds of changes in various states, including voter registration reform in California and Oregon, as mentioned in the materials that you all have. And finally, let's not forget about the courts, right? Tom's group, MALDEF, John Greenbaum's group, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, continue to do great work in terms of expanding voting rights. And this is, again, why this vacancy on the Supreme Court is so important, because so many of these cases have in the past been decided the wrong way, 5-4, including allowing some restrictions in the 2014 election in various states to go into effect. Those who are litigators should be and are aggressively litigating the right to vote as well.
I just wanted to add one quick other
and
thing.
then we're going to go to our video.
Is also, I think that if one of the things that we saw in Advancement Project represents the North Carolina NAACP in a big lawsuit that is their voter suppression law, which is crazy. But one of the things that I think cities also should be looking to do, which they took out of election law in North Carolina, is the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. Schools are a very good place to start registering people to vote. And they knew that in North Carolina, and they knew what the demographics were, so they decided we're going to roll that back. And so to the extent that we can see that happening in cities for young people of color, that would advance the ball.
Right. And actually, that's a good segue into our video question, if we can tee that up.
Hi, my name is Aiden, and I am a second year at the University of Chicago, majoring in history and political science. My question is, following the historic rise in voter turnout in 2008 and in 2012, what steps can be taken to compound on these gains while preventing efforts to disenfranchise young Black voters?
All right, so who wants to take that first?
So to just start, I think that issue around pre-registration, the ID situation that I talked about, and looking at cities. I think for young voters, The other problem with the way that we administer elections in particular is that elections are out of step with the rest of the world in terms of the use of technology. As someone who works with the Lawyers Committee on Election Protection, I remember answering the phones and people being like, I didn't see the website where I could vote. Because everything is easy now because you have everything in your hand. And I know that there's a lot of concerns around the technology, but at some point we have to invest in the actual infrastructure around voting to make it easier for people to do, because that's what this generation is used to. We have a public square called Twitter. We have everything is right there in your palm. And so I think we have to get to the point where we are making it much easier to engage.
So I first of all agree that, and I want to make sure that everybody understands, I don't think we're presenting a dichotomy, which is you got to work both on the federal and what's going on in states and cities, because what does happen in states and cities can then inspire what you can change at the federal and have it affect more broadly. And I think some of what we talked about is really important. I'll add, in California, there is a proposal pending now in the legislature that would actually allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote on school board elections. And similar limited voting has been extended in other states and other localities to non-citizens, also recognizing that lots of non-citizens are parents of those who are in school. So those are really important steps. But in terms of the immediate 2016 election, I think a couple of observations. First, I don't think we may not have the positive inspiration that existed in 2008, but we may have a negative inspiration that is just as powerful in getting folks who register to participate and to vote. But I would add to that, to prevent voter suppression in this 2016 election, we have to depend on vigilance and transparency. So many decisions are made by local registrars, are made very close to elections, that don't see the light of day when it comes to the national media. And there's really got to be folks out there who are highlighting what's going on, bringing it attention, and trying to prevent it from occurring, or at least creating enough information that folks can work together to get around those manufactured obstacles, even if they're manufactured a week before the election, even if they're manufactured in a dark room by a registrar who's hostile to certain voters.
Let me just emphasize and amplify this last point Tom makes, because this is something that everybody in this room can help out with, either by joining nonprofits, election protection efforts, or parties' election protection efforts. Election officials don't like to be criticized, right? They don't like to be. They don't like it when people assert that they're trying to deny their votes. So keeping a close eye on what's going on in this election season, and this is the time that those efforts really need to get started, and crying foul, raising hell when the right to vote is taken away or jeopardized. This is the best defense we have against these vote suppression efforts that we see in so many places.
Great. So we do need to go to audience Q&A, and I want to invite people in the audience to raise your hand if you've got a question for our panel. All right, we've got one over here.
It's not on.
Anyone? There we go.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Michelle Whitaker with Fair Vote. I'm Communications Director at Fair Vote. I don't. You haven't talked a lot about redistricting and gerrymandering, and so I'd be very interested in what your thoughts are on some of the policies and proposals, particularly in Maryland. There's a compact proposal along with like an independent redistricting commission. What are your thoughts on those types of proposals to address gerrymandering?
I think they're definitely worth looking at. The devil is in the details, but as a conceptual matter, I like the idea of taking the power to redistrict away from partisan legislative bodies and putting it in the hands of an independent commission of some kind with criteria that say what that body has to consider when drawing district lines. And those criteria should, of course, include assurance of adequate representation of racial minorities. So you know, we've actually adopted a redistricting reform measure. Miraculously, Democrats and Republicans came together to agree to something for the next redistricting cycle that will prevent the sort of egregious gerrymander we saw in my state last time around. We're you know, we're the consummate purple state, Ohio, and yet 3/4 of our congressional districts, 12 out of 16 of those districts are Republican districts. Nearly 2/3 of our state legislative districts are Republican districts. So they've basically got a lock on the legislature for this entire decade, despite the fact that at least in federal election cycles, the vote is split very close to 50-50, and of course Barack Obama won my state in both 2008 and 2012. So I think it's a serious problem, and that, to my mind, is the best approach to dealing with that problem.
So I would just agree with Dan that the devil's in the details about a lot of these redistricting reform proposals, but I would suggest there's two things that we need to guard against that unfortunately have characterized a lot of the debate around them. One, they all generally accept the existing political paradigm. So for example, in California, we adopted independent redistricting and set up a structure that says it's a 14-member commission and the two largest political parties each get 5 members of the commission. And then declined states get 4 members of the commission. The problem with that is that's not California today, and suggesting that somehow Democrats and Republicans are going to be close to equal anytime in the future in California doesn't reflect the political reality. But we're stuck with this constitutional formula that still gives overpowers the Republican Party, underpowers the declined to state voters in the structure that we've set up. So I think we have to work on setting up structures that are not premised on the existing political paradigm always being the same, particularly in a time of potential change. Second, I think that all of these reform proposals and the structures that are created assume that the only kind of competitiveness that matters is partisan competitiveness. And I rail against that because I don't think that's the reality of states like California today, where, for example, we're facing this year, because we have a top 2 system, we're looking at 2 congressional races. In one, 2 Asian American Democrats are pitted against each other, and in the other, 2 Latino Democrats are pitted against each other, with a high likelihood that both of those races end up with those candidates in a general election. So there are other types of competitiveness even within communities, and we have to recognize that as a reality and not only have a conversation that says we need to create competitive districts, and we define competitive districts as only getting Ds and Rs as closely combative as possible within those districts.
So I know we have a couple questions over there. I want to. Why don't we get 2 questions asked, and then we'll come back to this panel. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to. My question focused. I want to raise about mobilization. The only part of the labor movement that's grown in the last 20 years is really the service sector. And that's majority people of color, and especially women of color. And I think the conservatives have noticed that. And there was a Supreme Court ruling, Harris v. Quinn, last year, which really was an attack on home care workers, 90% of whom are people of color. There's on the docket now is, I think it's Fitzhugh, which is an attack on public sector workers, and this at a time when people of color, for the first time in history, are rising to leadership in the labor movement. And so I'm just want to throw back, I think we're used to operating in a bit of a silo in terms of talking about, you know, voting rights or contraction of democracy simply in terms of registration, where I think this is part of a broader conspiracy, if you will, and that we ought to be including the labor people too, particularly these leaders of color who are under attack right now in the Supreme Court and everywhere else. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, Barbara, and then I'm going to shoot it back to the panel.
Well, first of all, thank you to the panel. I think it's been, just an amazingly comprehensive discussion. Just wanted to raise a couple things. Judy, when we're talking about cities, I'm reminded so terribly of what happened in the last election around Memphis and their attempt to provide library identification as a viable voter ID in the state of Tennessee. But of course, the state law was designed to prohibit cities from having those options. So we have to, as we're thinking about, city power, we have to think about, the limitations that, states, how they're purposefully limiting that power. The other thing I was thinking about is for 2016, because we have lost, pre-clearance, and one of the things we've seen now since 2013 in the Shelby decision is that we've noticed the incredible problem of tracking local, especially small rural county and city and locality action. That, it just seems to me that one of the things I would love to hear your ideas on is how we broaden our networks, how we build more muscularity in our ability to track and cover and build capacity. And the last question is around midterm voting. We are losing at the midterm voting level. How do we build a different sense of pride and engagement around midterm voting? And how do we really, that's where we have to change our community's behaviors and their turnout and their engagement. So those are the ones I wanted to put on the table.
So Barbara
Thank you.
snuck in 3 questions there.
Sure did.
All right.
So I want to start with this mobilization midterm. I'm going to, from where I sit at Advancement Project, we work with grassroots organizations on the issues that they're confronting every day. We are part of a network of people who have been considered the movement for Black Lives. And I think that there is an incredible opportunity right now around the social and racial justice movements in this country to exert influence and power. And between the, Fight for 15 campaign and the extent to which people want to push back on prosecutors, want to push back on mayors who are being unaccountable, those midterms are the times when usually you have the local elections. So how are we galvanizing people to move towards the polls? With this caveat, there is also a sense of discontent and a sense that being part of a democracy that does not work and has not worked for us means that we should not participate. And I've been in lots of rooms with especially lots of young people who are like, we don't want to vote. We don't care about voting right now. We're going to mobilize. We're going to call people on what they're doing. But actually, going in and casting a ballot means nothing, because why are we voting for structures that were set up by oppressors who never wanted to take care of us or loved us in the first place? And so the question is, how do we get folks to the point where they want to engage? And some of that is also, how do we have some of those people running for some of these offices, right? Like, I'm listening to the sister up here in the last panel, I'm saying, damn, I want to vote for her. She might be, with a group that seems like they're extreme, but hell, I want extreme right now. So I think that we have got to be ready to especially engage the young people who are going toe-to-toe with the police, who are calling on ICE, who are doing these really incredible things across the country and are giving us energy around what democracy really means, right? And being able to pivot a little bit off of that to connecting the dots between those prosecutors, the election, and the mobilization that's happening in the streets.
So I think the midterm election question is critical, and I don't think that we've spent enough time really researching what the answers might be. I think there are lots of good ideas, and some of them we've heard, and I would say there are others, but I think part of it has to be about determining more specifically what it is that's driving turnout in presidential elections higher than midterm elections. Is it as simple as you have 2 personalities and a clash of 2 personalities? Or is it that during those years there's more of a clear ideological contrast between 2 institutions, the parties? What is it that's specifically driving it up? and what can we do to try to import that into midterm elections. If it's about personalities, then in states and cities you've got to work to create elections that have a clash of personalities at other levels, whether that's governor or mayor or whatever, that's going to bring people to the polls to vote on everything that's there, including the Congress that's on it. I also think part of the answer lies in money, and it's not just the poison of money that I know Dan would talk about writ large, but it's also that within the progressive community, we need to work on how we fund civic engagement. Yeah. I think institutional funders are good about doing it continually, but there are a lot of other funders, including individuals, who do it sporadically, and it goes by election. It peaks up. If it's a presidential election, it goes down in any off year. It goes up a little more in a midterm election, not quite as high as it is for the presidential. It goes down in an off year. And we've got to work on getting consistent investment in civic engagement to make the kinds of connections that Judith is talking about between the issues that are inspiring people today when there's not an election and when there is an election.
So can I try to connect these two questions? The mobilization point in midterm elections is incredibly important, as I'm sure many of you know. In the last two presidential elections, African American turnout and white turnout has been more or less at parity, within a couple percentage points. But there's a gap that develops in midterm elections. And there's a big gap in both presidential and midterm elections between black and white participation on the one hand and Latino and Asian American citizens' participation on the other. And so, you know, connecting these two questions, the mobilization question is really important, and intermediary organizations, which includes on the progressive side labor unions, are really important. I hate to mention another really important case before the Supreme Court right now, but Friedrichs versus CTA. It's probably going to be a split court. If Justice Scalia were still on the court, it would have dealt a devastating blow to public sector labor unions. And I'm in the middle of the country, right? There are no rich liberals where I live, right? Or virtually none, right? So if you're a progressive, and money matters, we all know money matters in politics. If you are a conservative, there are plenty of places you can go to. But in where I live, it's pretty much the labor unions that you can go to. I mean, there aren't any other deep or even medium-sized pockets. So emphasizing the point that the money really matters, and these intermediate organizations, especially organized labor, remain tremendously important in our politics.
How are we doing on time? I just want to do a check. We're good? Okay. So can I throw out a question, just because several of you have raised this, just we are in the midst of the Supreme Court vacancy battle. So what is the prospect of, I mean, what does that do to the prospects of change, both legal and policy, for us, now that there's this opportunity to shift the ideological balance of the court?
I think it clearly is an opportunity. I think we need to recognize that that opportunity manifests differently in different areas. I want to emphasize that, you know, the Shelby County decision is one of those decisions that we cannot get it back to the court without Congress doing something. Some of the other troubling precedents of recent years can come back to the court, either because of state legislation that's challenged and tees up the constitutional issue, whether that's about choice or about money in politics, the rest of it. But Shelby County and the pre-clearance provisions cannot get back to the court at all unless and until Congress acts to create a new coverage formula. I think it's important that we see the different ways that the opportunity, depending upon who is selected and confirmed to replace Justice Scalia, manifests differently depending on the issue.
I don't have anything to add other than hashtag fill the seat.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And let me trace it through these three dimensions. Tom's exactly right. It varies depending on the context. But participation, right? What it means is that you may be able to win some of these legal challenges under both the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act to practices like voter ID, restrictions on early voting, restrictions on voter registration. what it means is the Supreme Court might actually intervene to stop some of the most egregious partisan gerrymandering that we've seen, and it may also intervene to stop minority vote dilution, which is still a problem, as Tom very well knows, to this day. And what it means in the campaign finance context is that the court may get out of the way and allow reasonable restrictions on the flow of campaign money, which so distorts democratic equality, to take effect.
So, Vic, I want to add one more thing. I think it's really important that we make sure that we get a justice who is going to be a progressive leader, that we not settle for someone who is moderate because we feel like we have to. Because I'm just tired of, the other side doesn't settle.
Never.
In the way that too often, historically, we have settled. And I think we have to insist that we not settle.
And I'm going to keep adding. So, I mean, because I think there are other issues like affirmative action. This is is an incredible moment for this court, right? We do know in the next administration we'll probably see some other vacancies come. But this one seat could be the difference. And so filling it immediately, taking it, right, like you said, not moderate. I don't even want to see a moderate name come up. I want to see us go toe-to-toe with them about this. I want to call the hypocrisy in the fact that people who stand for the Constitution don't want this sitting president, African American, to fill this seat, right? We have got to be explicit about their hypocrisy. Not that it will matter to a lot of people who say they're for the Constitution, right? Because they're for the Constitution, except when it's a black man who's got to fill it, and he's a Democrat, and he's so-called progressive, maybe moderate, depends on where you sit. But I think that this is an opportunity for us to really call people on their motivations and to underscore for the American that, and I think there was a piece that talks about, had Scalia been alive, right, he would have wanted this seat filled immediately.
Right. So I'm glad that we got to ask the constitutional lawyers this question, and I know it's on a lot of our minds. We do need to wrap up. This was just an excellent discussion. Thank you for covering a lot of shoreline.
Thank you for
in
leading
this
us,
conversation. Yeah, absolutely. And what I want to just encourage us to think about as we go forward is, and I'm reminded of a comment that was made at one of the earlier Chicago roundtables, which is that we've got to think not only about equal access to democratic participation, but equal political power. So I want us to keep that in mind as we think about what was talked about today and the policy solutions ahead of us. I also want to encourage us to be bold and aspirational. Though I asked you to get real, we have to have aspirational policy goals, even if they're long-term. Pre-clearance may not happen again right now, but that has to be part of a 21st Century Voting Rights Act. And what does that mean with the changing country? At the same time, we want to be bold about the short-term wins because we need to get some of those gains to continue to build on this momentum. And that leads me to my last point, which is really ensuring that the policy discussions that we have today, whether it's around democracy or the other issues, really connects and taps into and is responsive to the energy that we feel today, that all of us are inspired by, with emerging social movements that are working to really change the public consciousness and discourse on issues of criminalization and political accountability and immigration and climate change. And so if we can just all carry that forward with us too, I think that this roundtable and the future ahead of us and working together, to me, is a bright one. So thank you.
Thank you.